It has been said that every great movement for freedom originated among mountain people. However true or untrue this may be, the movement to emancipate the illiterates of America originated among the people of the mountains of Kentucky. It is not something that America is doing for the mountain people, but something which they have contributed to the nation and to the world. In the 1910s, Kentucky was a rural agricultural-based society, dominated by Anglo-Celtic heritage. Life in the isolated Appalachia was centered on farms, family, and community. Many children grew up on farms or working at the family business, receiving no education. Some girls would leave school early to get married and have children, such as Estes Herman Webb, pictured here. She left school in 7th grade. While the rest of the United States industrialized and expanded public education under reforms like Horace Mann's Common Schools movement, much of Kentucky, especially the Appalachian Mountain District, remained isolated. Kentucky's poor education dated back to the early settlers, where change was not welcomed by Kentucky's inhabitants. When the Civil War struck, many schools had to close as young boys would be sent to fight. The Mountain District experienced the most setbacks. The poor and rural areas rarely received money or attention from the government to build schools or improve their education systems. Money for infrastructure always seemed to dry up before reaching the mountains, furthering Appalachia's isolation. Furthermore, most people in the mountains believed that education was a private matter not to be handled by the government. Many adopted the common Appalachian belief that living is more important than schooling. Schools in Kentucky were not funded by the state until 1904, 112 years after its founding. However, public education was delayed when it came to the Mountain District due to poverty, subsistence farming, and lack of transportation. Public education in Kentucky as a whole lagged far behind the rest of the states. By 1910, 208,000 Kentuckians over age 10 were illiterate. 120,000 of those were under age 45, and the highest rates were concentrated in the Mountain District. Many believed that nothing could be changed. Many doubted the practicality of teaching adults, believing that education was wasted on those past childhood.
There was a phrase back in the day that said, "You can't teach old dogs new tricks."
Illiteracy rates in Kentucky were growing, and for many, this reality was accepted. But for one educator, this was a problem that demanded reform. Her name was Cora Wilson Stewart. Stewart's reaction to the illiteracy crisis in Kentucky created the Moonlight School movement, a revolutionary initiative across the state that reformed literacy rates and education by making these opportunities accessible to the adults who needed it. Cora Wilson Stewart began teaching in 1895 and was later elected the first female superintendent of the Round County schools. While in that role, she volunteered as a secretary for illiterate adults. When she reflected on this work, she regretted the fact she only worked as a secretary instead of teaching them to read and write, calling it a mistaken kindness. She realized she was helping people live with illiteracy, instead of eliminating it. In her book, On the Emancipation of Adult Illiterates, Stewart described 3 appeals. 1. Mothers unable to read letters from distant children. 2. Men unable to vote in secrecy or read newspapers and the Bible. And 3. Young people whose talents were undeveloped. This reaction was what sparked the idea for education, but there were obstacles. Adults worked during the day, and schools were filled with children. She came up with the idea to have schools operate at night, but realized that the roads were dangerous in the dark. Then, Stewart found her answer: moonlight. Schools would only open on bright nights, so adults could safely travel after work, guided by the light of the moon. And when she asked teachers to volunteer, not one refused. On September 4th, 1911, Moonlight teachers canvassed the Round County area. Ads were published in the newspapers, and those who could read would share it with those who needed it. Churches hung up flyers. Volunteer teachers went door to door, inviting the educated and uneducated alike. On September 5th, the number of students expected to attend was 150. 1,200 arrived. The youngest was 18, the oldest, 86. In a single night, Stewart's reaction became a revolutionary reality, as it put adults back in the classroom. These first Moonlight schools in Round County, Kentucky, were just the beginning of a widespread initiative to teach illiterate adults. This movement didn't stay small. That first Moonlight school session was successful. In fact, it was so successful that the students began pushing for more. The second session surpassed the first, with 1,600 attendees. Stewart said it put the first session to shame. The goal was to wipe out illiteracy in Round County by the following year, and Stewart adopted the slogan, "Each one, teach one." Those who had been taught to read or write then went to teach someone else to do the same. By the end of the campaign, only 23 illiterates remained from the starting number of 1,152. In a state where illiteracy was deemed as inevitable, the Moonlight Schools upended that status quo. She turned neighbors into educators, and empty nights into opportunities, her movement transforming education from a privilege to a revolution of the common person. Newspapers amplified the movement beyond Round County, drawing attention from other states. The Richmond Times-Dispatch in Virginia acknowledged the movement, stating an enthusiasm for education has seized on Round County, and indeed it had. Moonlight schools were popping up all over, covering half of the counties in Kentucky by 1914. The press legitimized her movement statewide by framing it as both a moral and civic reform. Word of the movement spread rapidly.
Word spread through many avenues: newspapers, magazines, word of mouth, churches, women's clubs.
The timing of the movement mattered. During the Progressive Era, Americans were rethinking poverty, reform, and government accessibility.
By the late 1920s or mid-1920s even, people were sick of Kentucky being the illiteracy capital of the country. I think part of it was the times, the Progressive Era. There was a developing, idea that middle-class values, middle-class aspirations were beginning to develop.
Kentucky was ready for change. The reaction had become a revolution. Stewart required every student to write her a letter as a graduation requirement, not as a ceremony, but as proof to the transformation in reading and writing among adults. Literacy became visible and permanent to those Stewart's movement helped. Stewart understood that lasting change required state power. She established the Kentucky Illiteracy Commission with full support from the governor, James McCreary. With this support, the Illiteracy Commission flourished. The Illiteracy Commission gave Stewart and her movement more popularity. As seen in this letter, Stewart began pushing for bills to be introduced regarding adult education, the author stating, "Stewart has called attention to this bill, and she tells me this is the sort of bill that ought to be pressed." When the U.S. entered World War I, the draft exposed a national literacy crisis.
Cora wrote a book, The Soldier's First Book, because she believed that it was immoral almost to try to send people, draft people into the military who could not read and write, and that was for two reasons. One, they could not communicate with their families back home, and two, they couldn't read field manuals or understand their instruction in written form.
She wrote this book, The Soldier's First Book, under the condition that it must be distributed to every illiterate soldier for free. Literacy was tied to democracy, civic participation, and now national defense. The Kentucky Illiteracy Commission oversaw the instruction of those eligible to be drafted and ensuring they received the 3 R's of education: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Moonlight schools were the vessel for draft-eligible adults to be taught. By the 1920s, Stewart became a national figure, traveling across the U.S. to promote adult education and advise communities seeking to replicate the Moonlight School model. She spoke before educators, lawmakers, and reform organizations, arguing that literacy was not a personal failure, but a responsibility of the state. As a woman shaping public education during the Progressive Era, what began as a reaction to the illiteracy crisis evolved into a revolution in access, and ultimately a reform in the illiteracy crisis and the way adult education is handled. Literacy became recognized as not a privilege, but as a fundamental principle of democracy.
It was imaginative. It was hopeful. It was generous.
Under the light of the moon, adults who had once been excluded from education claimed their place in a newfound movement of learning. Imagination sparked reaction. Hope sustained a revolution. Generosity secured reform. Under the light of the moon, education became not a privilege, but a democratic right. That is the power of reaction, revolution, and reform.